Google Doc up, ready to do questions with Bert?
Yes, I've got the Google Doc,
Okay.
and I don't need to see any controls on the.
No, you don't. As long as it's streaming, you're good.
So I don't really need to see it. I'll just have a little bit of myself in there. So I've got the Google Doc and I've got the cam going. Here I see some questions on the in the chat. See some questions on the in the chat. See some questions on the in the chat. Okay, it's muted.
Okay, perfect. All right. Awesome. Alrighty. Alright, so I'm gonna hang up now. You can start answering questions. If it's sent to Facebook.
So I'm not on the Facebook.
You're live on Explore. It'll be just a second until it's live on Facebook. Facebook takes a little bit, takes a second for it to get live there. I'm sure people in the Explore chat are like, we can see you, we can hear you. Probably hear me too. Hello, Explore chat. So much action going on in Santa Monica today. Helicopters, sirens, horns. Going.
So we're waiting for the Facebook world to catch up with us now before we start.
We are. Yeah, it takes a second. Alright, you're live on Facebook. If I'm on to go, introduce yourself and have a fantastic chat.
Okay, and someone will feed me Facebook questions.
Yeah, Rick is collecting all of them.
Okay.
In the same document.
Great.
Alright,
All right. Well, then let's get started.
let's get started.
Okay, bye. Hello, everybody. Rob Beauregard here. For those of you who don't know me, most people who do know me, especially in the Osprey world, and most of my students know me as Dr. B. I've been studying ospreys for 47 years. I climbed into my first osprey nest on Martha's Vineyard in 1971, and I've been studying them pretty much nonstop ever since. I did take a little break to go to the Amazon for 8 years, where I saw some ospreys but didn't do any research. So most of my background with ospreys has been in southern New England. I ran a big research. I've been organizing a census of ospreys on Martha's Vineyard ever since there were 2 pairs back in 1971, and now this year we just wrapped up the full inventory or census of Martha's Vineyard ospreys, and we got to 97 pairs, which is really amazing. That's 6 higher than the previous record there, and quite a testament to how quickly ospreys rebounded from the DDT era. Besides censusing the ospreys on Martha's Vineyard, I've done a lot of satellite tracking, and I think many of you have been following my Osprey Tracks website. Since the year 2000, I and my colleagues have put satellite tracking devices on 108 ospreys, everywhere from South Carolina all the way up to St. John's in Newfoundland. So I've also, for the past 4 or 5 years, been leading the Rapture camp at Audubon's Hog Island sanctuary up in the central coast of Maine. We have a session coming up starting on, I think, July 8th through the 13th, and there's still a few places available on that. So I hope some of you may get interested enough to and find the time to come and join us. It's a great 4 or 5 days in a beautiful habitat right underneath the ospreys that you've all been listening to and watching, for some of you, for quite a few years. So I'm going to jump in, and I've got a list of questions here that you've submitted, and I will go through and see how many of them I can answer, and I think we'll probably have some more come in as the hour progresses. First question asks if Rachel or Steve have memories from past years that they have learned from in order to protect their chicks. This, of course, refers to the both bald eagle attacks and the great horned owl attacks of last year, which cost Rachel and Steve 5 or 6 young have been lost to those 2 predators. Will they stay closer and or on higher alert after what has happened in the past? I don't think anyone can really answer that question. I suspect not. I think their level of instinct is what it is. Perhaps it'll be a little sharper. One of the questions that I'm not sure it pops up here, but other people have asked me is, where is Steve and why isn't he closer to the nest? He may be roosting across the bay and not be able to either hear or fly across the bay in the dark when he hears Rachel giving distress calls, as she did in the last couple of nights. I suspect that must almost definitely be the great horned owl. She sensed or saw a great horned owl in the area and was giving those alarm calls. Could have been a raccoon climbing up in a neighboring tree. There's something disturbed her, and without seeing what it was, of course, we can't say. So we'll have to see. I don't think they're going to pay any more attention or be more vigilant. They're just going to be as vigilant as their instincts tell them to be. Have there been any efforts to keep the bees and wasps away from the nest this year? I'm not sure. I haven't been up on the island, so I can't tell. I'm not sure what Eric could do. I suppose at this early stage, if we see wasps around the nest, we might be able to get a ladder up and spray something to kill the wasps or bees if that happens early on in the nesting season. Ospreys and other birds have scales on their legs and feet. Are these scales replaced one at a time, or do they slough off like a snake's scaly skin is shed? How often are they shed? What's the significance of these scales to osprey? All birds have scales on their feet and legs, and they're not molted like feathers or shed like a snake's skin. They may sort of peel off. I've had birds of prey for a long time, and I've never really noticed anything special happening with those scales on their legs. We used to think that birds' feathers were a modified scale from what they have on their feet and legs, but we've since discovered that that's not the case. How do ospreys sharpen their talons? Their talons are constantly growing. It's like a fingernail, just like the bird's beak as well. So they're constantly growing, and they just naturally wear them down as they're perching on rough surfaces. If you keep birds of prey in captivity and they don't have a rough surface that they're walking on to actually dull down the ends of their talons, so they can get very overgrown. The same thing with their beaks. When a raptor is done feeding on something, it will strop its beak, clean its beak off on whatever branch it's on, and just that process is enough to keep the beak at an appropriate length. Rob, what is your best guess regarding Rachel repeating the adaptive behavior she used to protect Bailey from the great horned owl attack last year? Will she remember that, or will it be done in a reaction from a threat? Have you heard of a female osprey doing this before? I'm not sure exactly what the reference is there, but one thing that I suspect she will stay close to the nest, and if, as we saw last year when the great horned owl after it took 1 and 2 young, Rachel got right down into the nest and was there pretty much on guard and saved Bailey from the last attack. So I don't know whether she'll start out that way, or whether if there is an attack, she'll get close into the nest and really stand guard. Time will have to tell on that one. Is there a link to the BBC documentary about migration that you were involved with? That was back in 2004, and this person says they'd love to watch it. There isn't. I've got a copy of it, but I don't think it's online anywhere, so I might check with the BBC about that, but I suspect that one is, if you emailed me, I could lend it out, but there's no easy way to get to it. When ospreys winter in warmer areas, do all the males from Northeast U.S. go to the same place, and all the females go to a different place? Do they tend to go back to the same winter homes? I was thinking of all this as the hurricanes were so violent in the Caribbean, wondering how ospreys were affected. That's a great question. Males and females go to different places, different winter retreats or headquarters. They don't. The birds from New England, the males from New England, don't go to the same place. They spread out. Probably 90% or 95% of the New England ospreys make it to South America. Males tend to go stay a little bit further north in South America than females do. And this is true of a lot of birds. And this is probably because males are often the first ones to get back in many species, and they're the ones they're the sex that claims the territory. So there's a premium on getting back early so that you get first dibs on your territory, and you don't have some young whippersnapper settling in thinking he can take over your territory. So females tend to go a little bit further south, but when you look at all of the birds that I've tagged, the ospreys I've tagged over the past 18 years, they're really spread out all over the place. Some have wound up in Panama, some in Florida, South Carolina, some in Cuba, but most in South America. Here's a question from Newfoundland, where I tagged a female up on Snow's Lane down the road from this person. That bird was Shauna, or Shauna did it. She did not make it south on her second trip. Well, she made it to the Caribbean, and sadly about 25 miles south of the Colombian coastline, something happened to her. Presumably she flew into some really bad weather and didn't survive. We got a radio back. Somebody, Gerard Hickey up in St. John's in Newfoundland, actually tracked down where the signal was coming from, found a restaurant nearby, called them up, and we actually got that transmitter back. But unfortunately, the transmitter isn't working. This is a transmitter that between Shauna Did It and North Fork Bob, the last bird to carry the transmitter, that transmitter was carried by those two different ospreys over 72,000 miles. Pretty amazing. Some of the behaviors of the chicks are instinctual, but how many are learned by example from parents? One example is their pooping. They seem to automatically know to back up to the sides of the nest to shoot. And often if the Osprey Zone camera down in Long Island, if those birds have a particularly good aim at the camera that's recording them, Almost all of this behavior that the young are seeing in the nest, that we see the young do in the nest, is instinctual. And that goes all the way to the pecking of the smaller young by the larger young. That it's a scene that we see again and again on osprey cams, and it's really hard to watch. It seems as though the birds are being mean or cruel, but they're not. They're just following their own instincts. The bigger chicks will almost always beat up on the smaller chicks, especially if there's not much food to go around. And that's what it's all about. It's really an insurance policy in case there's not enough young food coming into the nest for all three young. The bigger and more dominant young will wind up with virtually all the food that's coming in if it's just enough for him and so or her, and that bird would survive. If three young were all the same size and they divvied up only enough food for one young between the three of them, they'd all die. So this is just nature's way. It's an insurance policy, and I often hear on the discussion groups, especially when this kind of thing is happening, that nature is cruel. But I want to really emphasize that nature isn't cruel, because being cruel involves being harmful or hurtful just to be harmful or hurtful. And what these birds are doing is just following their own instinct. So we can't say nature is cruel. We can certainly say it's harsh. We can say it's random. It's unforgiving. And don't forget that it's wonderful. But it certainly isn't cruel. So I'm wondering, and the next question ties right into that. I was wondering if and how the very close hatch dates will influence the chick's chances of survival. So this year at the Hog Island nest, the young hatched in very short, close sequence. Sometimes there's quite a bit of a staggering of the hatch. The birds, Rachel tends to lay her eggs about 3 days apart. So if they had 3 eggs, and if she started incubating hard and consistently with the first egg, that young would start to develop the day she really started to incubate hard. And then 3 days later, the next embryo would start to develop, and 3 days later, the next would start to develop. So there could be a 6-day difference between the oldest and the youngest hatched young. If there were a 4th egg in the nest, you could have an even bigger spread. So typically that dominance hierarchy that's set up in the nest is initially established really by the hatching sequence. And so with 3 birds hatching all pretty much at the same time, there isn't going to be a clear dominance. So it will be interesting to see how that works out. If Steve is his usual good providing self, there shouldn't be any issues. But it will be interesting to see if food is short, to see how those 3 more or less equal age ospreys fare. Any females will grow a little bigger, so they'll have a little bit of an advantage, especially if one of the first hatched was a female. So that might help set up somewhat of a hierarchy. There was a hailstorm last week at another nest, which was on pip watch. Mom protected her eggs, but it made me wonder what would happen if an egg suffered a small crack just days before it was due to hatch. If the chick had already started to breathe in the air sac, could it survive a small break? I think so. That's just a wild guess on my part, because I'm not an expert on that particular part of avian biology. But once the young has perforated there's a little air sac, and anybody who's cracked a hard-boiled egg knows about that. If you look at the blunt end, or if you crack the blunt end of your next hard-boiled egg, if you haven't done this experiment already, crack the blunt end, and you'll see there's a little air space in there. So when the chick is hatching, it will actually use its beak and pop its beak into that air sac and begin to breathe air from that so that its lungs begin to function. So once that's happened, it's likely that a crack in the eggshell wouldn't be intolerable to the embryo. Do ospreys ever fall out of the nest or accidentally knock each other out? I've seen it happen at multiple eagle nests and was wondering if the same happened with ospreys. If not, do you know why not? It does happen. Sometimes it happens through sibling aggression with a dominant young pushing a smaller subordinate young out of the nest. It can happen accidentally. So yes, it does, and it can happen. And so if not, do you know why not? Part of the question isn't really relevant. So sometimes it happens, but not very often. Is the type of band used on chicks determined by the bander, or is there some other protocol? Why don't we, United States, use plastic Darvik bands used in Wales, which are glued and not screwed on with metal parts that seem to open chicks up to getting caught on nest materials? I don't know the answer to that question. Some people band with color bands, some don't. And I guess I don't think there's anything dictated by the banding lab. I think some people may feel that the riveted bands that might get caught on something are more permanent, but I think that's a personal preference on the part of the banders. I would like to know if 3 eggs is an average clutch each year for ospreys, and if you see more boy or girl babies being born. 3 is the absolute average number of eggs laid in a nest. Occasionally you'll get 2. A very young pair may lay 1 or 2 eggs, but over 90% of osprey nests have 3 eggs in them. Sometimes overachievers will lay a 4th egg, and sometimes that 4th young will fledge. Early on Martha's Vineyard, in those early years when there were only 2 pairs of ospreys, the 2 pairs were routinely fledging 3 or 4 young every year. So that was a situation where there were very few, only 2 pairs on the Great Big Island that has room for lots of ospreys, as we now know, since there are 97 pairs there. So in those years with lots of food, 2 of those females, the 2 females were laying sometimes 4 egg clutches. Why don't you think Dottie and Doug or any other osprey pair use the boathouse nest platform? Those are last year. These are probably housekeeping pairs. Those are typically young birds that are on their first or second return trip from South America, and it takes them a while to get going, get things all under control, and sort out the whole process of laying eggs. So one thing certainly might have happened is that the 2 birds that came back last year, one of them didn't make it back through the next migration cycle. So we only had Dottie or Doug, and the other didn't come back. So if you have a young bird that's come back, he or she may be looking for a mate, and they may begin that whole the sort of learning process of doing getting the whole breeding system going. They may go back to stage 1. So that maybe is why they didn't use the nest this season. As I recall, a pathogen was transmitted from black flies to the eaglets at the North Deborah, I think that's Decorah nest, killing them. Are ospreys susceptible to the same thing? I don't know the answer to that question, so I'm not sure what the pathogen would have been. But typically, if I wouldn't expect an osprey to not be susceptible to something that would kill a bald eagle. So my guess is whatever it was, the ospreys might be susceptible to it. Next question, is the type of band used on chicks determined by the bander, or is there some other protocol? Oh, this is basically the same question as above. Sorry. So yes, it's determined by the bander, and some people in the States do use the Darvik bands. So I don't know, other than more than what I've already said. Rachel was giving alert calls last night. Do you think she remembers the great horned owl attacks and will be extra diligent in protecting her chicks this year? Pretty much covered this already. She may be more diligent. She's toughed it out once, so hopefully she will again if that comes, if the owls come back. I have 2 mini chihuahuas and have been constantly stalked and circled by hawks. They're on leashes, but these hawks are relentless. Will they go after my dogs, even if I'm here? Assuming these must be red tails, and no, the raptors wouldn't take I don't believe a red tail would take a dog off a leash, but they certainly could take a mini chihuahua if it was out in the yard. Okay, back to ospreys. Last year, Rachel flew after the owl during the night, protecting her chicks. So does that mean ospreys see better in the dark than what we previously thought? My ospreys, some of my ospreys can fly, have flown through the night when they're migrating. Now that's up above cloud cover, up above the tree level, and so they don't really have to fly through anything. Certainly on a moonlit night or a rather brightly lit night, ospreys can get around. Rachel did it last year, so we know they can. And maybe we're underestimating what ospreys can do, but I don't think on a real dark night, I don't think Steve could make it over from if he's roosting across the bay or the cove back in America. I doubt he could make it over there and help defend the nest if he was close by. Do you agree with injured ospreys being kept in captivity as one of the ICBP Gloucester and then breeding from it? Yeah, I think if an osprey is injured and can be kept in captivity, it's worthwhile. That's a quality of life decision. Ospreys do really poorly in captivity. It's very hard. They're sort of schizo, and it's very strange that a raptor that's so used to nesting in such close proximity to humans, they nest on light towers in Walmart parking lots, or they nest just the boathouse at Hog Island, or people walking back and forth, talking underneath their nest all the time. So ospreys are fine with that, but when you put your hands on them and put them in a cage and try to take care of them, they're really pretty schizo, and some people are successful at keeping ospreys in captivity. My co-instructor at the Raptor Rapture session, Ian McLeod, up at the Squam Lakes Natural Science Center, kept an injured osprey for 4 or 5 years and did a lot of good educational work with it. As for keeping it into a breeding program, or keeping one and breeding from it, I would be really doubtful that an injured osprey in captivity would breed. That you almost always would need to have one raised from a young to be calm enough to breed in captivity, but maybe it could happen. So, next question. Why has there been so much competition for nests this year? Don't they use the same nest each year? Well, they do, in fact, have a lot of competition. They do come back to the same nests, and but not often, about 15% of the time, birds will not survive their migration cycle. So, so when birds don't come back, there will often be a fight between potential contenders to fill the vacancy, and they're just ospreys have been so successful that there are more and more young looking for nests, and birds are so young birds may be just trying to insert themselves into a breeding pair, split up a breeding pair. So I think we're seeing so much competition because there are so many young being fledged. Ospreys are doing quite well. The only places they're not doing well are typically places where their bald eagles are doing really well. And we've, of course, been seeing this in coastal Maine with bald eagle numbers coming up, and they're preying on young ospreys in nests. Frankly, I'm a little surprised that doesn't happen more often. An osprey nest full of young looks to me like a little hors d'oeuvre platter for a bald eagle. And it's one of the reasons, perhaps, that ospreys will nest in almost colonial circumstances if the nesting opportunities present, and if there's a lot of local food. Down in the mouth of the Connecticut River, you can see 30 osprey nests from one place. The same holds true at the mouth of the Westport River in southeastern Massachusetts. No bald eagle is going to make it through even close to any of those nests, with all of the males there sort of on patrol waiting for trouble to come in. But when you have scattered nests, osprey nests in the middle of bald eagle country, there's a lot of vulnerability there, as we've seen. So next question, is it better to arrive early on the breeding ground in less than tip-top condition, or to arrive a little late in A+ condition? That's an insightful question, and a hard one, probably impossible to answer. Some people may have gotten a handle on this with songbirds, where you can get a larger sample size. But since we can't really assess the condition of ospreys when they get back, and don't often know the timing of when they get back, that would be hard to answer for ospreys, but it's certainly one of the risk and reward situations involved in migration. Do you hustle back and just claim your nest even if you're not in great shape, or does lingering a little bit get you a chance to be in A1 condition? I think the A1 condition is probably more dictated by what's going on in the wintering grounds, and maybe the weather weather that the birds are flying through on the way north. I would expect that almost every osprey is leaving the wintering grounds in pretty much A+ condition. Remember that both males and females, when they're on the wintering grounds, only need to feed themselves. So they really only need to catch one good-sized fish a day, and they're fine. We had one osprey that was satellite tagged, and he spent 5 months in a quarter of a square mile of, I think, Venezuela. So he just found a big pond full of fish and never left for 5 months. So a lot of if they're coming back in less than A+ conditions, probably has to do with running into really bad weather and poor hunting conditions on their way north. About what age do the young chicks stop being aggressive and bonking one another? That can go on fairly long into fairly well into the breeding season. Typically young ospreys fledge at about 8 weeks. So I would think that wouldn't be unusual to see that right up and through the 4th or 5th week as the young are developing. Next question, have any of Steve and Rachel's older chicks been spotted nesting anywhere? No is the answer to that, but it's extremely unlikely that they would have been, because we've only banded a couple, and they're likely to come back to the same general area. Males typically nest within about 15 miles of where they were born. Females wander a little bit more. So the young from Rachel and Steve's nest, we've only banded a few, and those birds will be sort of scattering themselves across the coastal Maine habitat where people aren't watching nests very carefully, and you need spotting scopes to see them. So the chances of our recognizing one of the few banded young that we have banded at Rachel and Steve's nest is pretty minuscule. Has there ever been a trio nest with ospreys? Yes, there has. There was a nest in South Carolina that I knew about where we had 2 males. that would both feed the young and defend the nest. We watched two of them fly off, and a turkey vulture was getting a little close to the nest, so the two ospreys went off, and two males went off in a little squadron and chased the vulture away. Often there'll be, not often, but occasionally we see three young at a nest, three adults at a nest, and typically it's the extra bird trying to insinuate itself. I do believe there's a case where a female was tolerated at a nest, but it's pretty rare. Where do they like to nest? Ospreys like to nest obviously close to water, but they can, but that's not the most important thing for them. They'll occasionally nest as far as 10 miles from where they're fishing. There was a colony down in North Carolina that they found it, I believe it was a lake, a flooded lake that had lots of dead trees, so it was great nest sites, but the birds had to fly 10 miles or so to do their fishing. So often, and another example is out in Mono Lake in California, which is Mono Lake is a hypersaline lake, meaning it's below sea level, so it's very salty, sort of like the Salt Lake or the Dead Sea, and it's so salty that there are no fish in it. But there are these big towers that are called tufa towers, which stand 10 or 20, 30 feet up out in the middle of the water. Perfect little big platforms for ospreys to nest on. And ospreys love to nest out on a nest that's out in the water. What that means that, of course, the nest is protected from any ground predators like raccoons. So ospreys, when they see a nest site like that, will often just use the nest site and then figure out where the fish are later. So they like to nest in a protected spot. They like to nest in an isolated tree that sticks up above everything else around them. And they do that because they have very long wings and they're not very agile. So they can't fly through the branches of a tree the way a red-tailed hawk could to get to its nest. So they really like those exposed nests because they want to have an upwind landing. Whichever way the wind is blowing, they want to be able to come into the nest carrying that great big fish and land into the wind. It's the same reason that there are more than one runways at airports, because no pilot wants to make a downwind landing. So by having a nest out in the open, that makes it easy for the birds to get into their nests when they're carrying food. And of course, as we know now, ospreys love to nest on things that we build. Cell towers are just, as far as ospreys are concerned, osprey nest poles that they let us put communication equipment on. Over 90% of the nests that we know of in southern New England, sort of from New York to, let's say, the New Hampshire border, are on man-made structures of some sort. So they've really taken that behavior for adopting man-made structures as nest sites is probably a good part of the explanation why there are more ospreys now than there were before DDT. Is there any way of knowing the origin of Bailey's injury? The owl attack, the fall after the wasp attack, the eagle attack, her being injured in transport. Probably not the being injured in transport. I think the bird was injured in one of the first, either the original owl attack, the fall from the tree, or maybe the eagle attack. No way to tell what that was. What's the oldest age an osprey can still lay viable eggs? The record is a female osprey in Scotland lived for 27 years and fledged 50 young over that 27-year period. Now that bird is way out on the end of the bell curve. She was a serious outlier, and I believe she went through 6 or 7 different males, which is somewhat amusing, but it sort of makes sense when you think that the males are doing all the hunting for the family. So the female she has the drudgery work of sitting on keeping the eggs warm for 38 days, keeping the young warm when it's cold, shaded when it's hot, dry when it's raining. And so she's not really moving anywhere for most of that, about 2 months during the breeding season, the peak of the breeding season. And in the meantime, the male is going out to forage for all of the food for himself, for the female, and for the young. So he really puts a lot of miles on the ospreyometer. So it doesn't really surprise me that the males, that old female survived so many outlived so many different males. So the last question at the moment is, when the nest is being attacked, would it be wrong for someone to be alerted so they could go out to underneath the nest to scare away the attacker? I don't think that would be wrong. I'd certainly do it. Some people, I think in general, we don't want it at these nests, we don't interfere. We don't go and rescue young. If there's a subordinate young that's starving, we're not going to take it out of the nest and move it to another nest. We're not going to intervene in those circumstances. But to some extent, we intervene preemptorily by putting predator guards on nest poles. All of the poles on Martha's Vineyard have aluminum flashing around them so raccoons can't get to them. So if I were around the nest and I saw an attack going on that I could intervene in, I would. I don't think that would, in my mind, that wouldn't be interfering with the sort of course of evolution. That's just a random event. The attack of a predator on a raptor nest is not part of the natural selective process. That's just one of the real random parts of nature. Earlier this hour, I said that nature is not cruel, but it can be harsh, unforgiving, and it very often is random. The animals that don't make it into the next generation, probably more often than not, if they don't make it into the next generation, it wasn't because they didn't have a great set of genes. It was just because they were in the wrong place at the wrong time. A bald eagle happened to fly over the nest when the parents were both away, and the young osprey is taken by the eagle. There's nothing to do with natural selection. So I would certainly defend a nest if I could. In Europe, where I live, people build platforms for storks on which to build their nests. You mentioned ospreys like cell towers. Is there any need to build platforms for ospreys, or are they doing well enough without? Yes, we build a lot of platforms for our ospreys, especially down south in southern New England and points south. The cell tower companies are, as I mentioned earlier, the cell tower companies basically are putting up osprey platforms. And in some areas we do need to put platforms up. We don't leave dead trees standing around as much as we used to, particularly in areas that have a lot of humans. So there aren't really as many natural nest sites as there used to be for ospreys. And we've sort of gotten to the point now where I think ospreys can be creatures of habit. And an earlier question asked about what do young ospreys learn, and there's a suggestion that young birds of prey learn about their nest situation, the type of nest they're in. So ospreys that are born on a platform may look for a platform when it comes time for them to breed. So our colleague over in Finland, Pertti Sarola, has often said that the ospreys in Finland are prisoners of platforms, meaning that once they've sort of been hooked on platforms, that's what they need. And we've got such a big osprey population now, particularly in southern New England, that they're nesting in lots of problem situations, particularly on live power lines. So we wind up putting platforms up for them to get them off of the power line, And then, so now you've got another pair that's nesting on poles and platforms. And so we've created so many of these nests that we really have now sort of, we need to adopt the role, as Paul Spitzer said, of being osprey gardeners. We need to maintain those platforms. If you don't maintain the platforms, ospreys are going to go look for a similar nesting situation, and very often that could be in a situation that's problematic, like on a live power line. Does the male take over care after the chicks fledge? Sometimes even, yes is the answer to that question. The females leave in the middle of August, not long after the young have fledged, and the male at that point is going to be doing all the feeding. The female will usually do some feeding toward the latter part of the nestling period and while the young are learning to fly. The parents don't teach their young to hunt. I hear that a lot, but there's good evidence that the young do not pay attention they don't follow their parents, they don't pay attention what the parents are doing. They go off and learn to hunt all by themselves, and all the parents do is basically give them an allowance. They keep feeding them fish while the young are learning how to hunt how to catch fish by trial and error. Typically within, there was a group of about 25 ospreys that were followed down in Florida, and by the first ones had caught a fish within 5 or 6 days, and I think by 10 or 11 days, pretty much all of them had caught their first fish. So females take off, and the males hang around for another month, and the males and the young all leave about the same time. So in southern New England, where I've been doing my work, typically females leave in mid-August, and most of the adults and the young will head south for the first time in the first 2 weeks of September. So that's all the questions that have come in so far. I don't know if there are any over on let me check. Over on the chat board. So while I'm looking for questions, I have a bit of news, and that which may not be news to some of you. But I do, I've published my first kids book. It's called Bell's Journey. It's about a young osprey that I tagged on Martha's Vineyard. The real Belle was tagged in 2010 and survived her first migration cycle. In fact, she survived 6 migration cycles, and she was last heard from last spring after her transmitter mated almost 7 years. So I've written, so the book is called Bell's Journey. It's a middle school 100-page plus chapter book that I'm sure your grandchildren and kids would love to read. Let's see, I'm not seeing any new questions. Let's see if there's... So I'm not seeing any more questions. So I guess we'll wrap it up. Once again, I hope that some of you can join us at the Rapture session. Don't worry about the rapture part. If either that hasn't happened in the first 4 years we've done the program, or if it did happen, we all got left behind. So everything was good. But it's a great way to go up and learn about birds of prey. We'll go out, we'll band the ospreys at the nest, and do a lot of hands-on activities with raptors, do some birding over on the mainland. And it's a wonderful place to be for a week in early or to mid-July. So I guess I will sign off then, and we'll pass it back to the live stream from the nest. So thanks for all the great questions, and maybe we'll do another session later in the season after the young have gotten a little bit bigger. So thanks everybody, and May fair winds speed all your journeys. Bye.